there's kind of two major important events that happened this week. One of them is the death of Aharon's children, Nadav and Avihu, who now the Mishkan, the tabernacle, has started working. They bring in a korban, an offering, which has not been given permission, and the fire explodes and they are killed in it. So it's this unbelievably tragic, sad event. And the Parsha deals with how Aharon deals with the mourning while also being a public figure. So I'm going to speak more about that tomorrow. But today, what I want to discuss is kashrut, because this week's Parsha is one of the major sources of kashrut. And when we think of kashrut today, we usually think about, I'm going to go buy a packet of sugar, what's the kosher symbol, the hechsher on it? Or I guess you can't get a packet of ketchup anymore in the restaurants. If you haven't been following that, there's no more ketchup packets in restaurants anymore. But if you wanted to find one with a kosher symbol, but kashrut at the end of the day is much simpler. Kashrut at the end of the day is really just about what are the things, the animals that we can and cannot eat. And almost all of those rules are in this week's parasha. So what I want to do is we'll look at the verses in this week's parsha discussing what animals are kosher, and we'll see if the text at least hints at the why. Because oftentimes, again, as I said before, the mitzvot in the Torah don't explain. When God says do this, God doesn't give us a reason. So there developed this huge body of literature, the ta'amei mitzvot, the reasons for the mitzvot. So we'll look at the text, then we'll look at the rabbis trying to propose different reasons, and we'll see them fighting back and forth with each other, saying your reason is ridiculous, it could never be true. And it's exciting to think about, like, were they angry, or is it purely friendly, jabbing, whatever it was? But they were really, even though God didn't tell us what it meant, they really thought, how dare you suggest this? By the way, I do actually know what the right reason is. And then at the end, we'll look at a few beautiful sources, including some more relatively recent rabbis, who suggest that we can't know the actual reason for it. But as I said about the Shoah, we can still give some meaning to the actual experience of keeping kashrut. So Lynn, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. You just got to click on your side, and I will let you take the first couple verses. So again, they're pretty much all in chapter 11. I think they're all in chapter 11 of Vayikra. So if you'll take the first source, please, and a few words after you read, I'll go back in the Hebrew and say, this is the word in Hebrew, because those are like keywords. So please.
Speak to the children of Israel, saying, these are the creatures that you may eat from among all the animals that are upon earth. Everything among the animals that has a split hoof, which is completely separated into double hooves, and that brings up its cud, that one you may eat.
Excellent. Now, there are other things about what we can and can't use in terms of animals, in terms of sacrifices, discussed in other parshas and will be in the future. And going back to the story of Noah's Ark, I mean, here I call this Noah's Ark in Delhi, but really after the flood, the Mabul with Noah, and he came out, God basically gave humanity, not Jews, not Israelites, but all humanity, some new rules for animals, and specifically said, now you can start. Do you happen to know what God gave us permission to eat after the flood we couldn't eat before, Lynn?
Before?
Animals in general.
Oh, right.
And now many rabbis argue back and forth. Does that mean we're vegetarians beforehand? And there are a few rules. He says you can't go to the wild and just rip an animal to shreds like you are a beast yourself and eat it. But otherwise, we could eat lobster and shellfish. So humanity was allowed to eat animals with a few rules, but that was a far cry from kosher. But the idea of limiting what we can eat has already been introduced, but there's never been a real explanation for it. And we're going to get, so this doesn't, it just gives us some rules that seem to be illogical. Split hooves, chewing its cud. What does that have to do with anything? And again, the rabbis have proposed ideas and academics, but we don't really know yet. If you want to go on, Lynn, for a couple more verses, the next one, which is again, just about 10 verses later.
Sure. These shall you abominate from among the birds. They may not be eaten. They are abomination. The eagle, the osprey, and the aznaya.
Excellent, thank you. So some of these birds, we're not sure what they are. That's why it's not translated there. But the key word here, besides what animals you can and can't eat, is first of all, there's no specific rule. A lot of people say, oh, it's about birds of prey and not birds of prey. And no, all the Torah says is, here are the list of animals that you can eat and that you can't eat, which becomes complicated because I think we had a class on turkey. Turkey is not in either of the lists. So is it permitted or is it forbidden? So the rabbis eventually developed their own rules, but the key here is abomination. In Hebrew, it says teshaktsu, or sheketz. So this word shkatzim is things that which are disgusting. So we're getting kind of a hint here. There's something fundamentally bad about unkosher animal. They're shkatzim. And even though it doesn't say it about all of the other animals like cows, it is hinting at that there's something fundamentally wrong with those birds. But again, do we know what that is? And that might lead the rabbis to say, what do these forbidden birds have in common? Well, they're all birds of prey or something like that. So that there does seem to be some kind of logical rule developing here. And Lynn, you can go on for, you can just take the rest of the section. So verse 3, please.
This is what you may eat of all that is in the water. You may eat any creature that lives in the water, whether in seas or rivers, as long as it has fins and scales.
Excellent. So this is the famous thing about fish, and we can eat salmon, etc. But here again, no reason, and it does not mention that the other fish of the sea, the other sea creatures, are shkatzim, are these abominable things. So does that mean it's only for the birds? And we'll see it again by insects. Is there something unique about flying things? Or should we apply it to all things that are forbidden? All forbidden foods are disgusting and abominable, which also is troubling, because what does that say about other peoples who are not idolaters? There's this general assumption in the Torah: if you're not Jewish and you're an idolater, you're bad. But if you're not Jewish and you're not an idolater, you're great. You can be our brothers, cousins, neighbors. We'll make peace with you, no problem. Live and be healthy. But if we're saying that the foods they're eating are abominable and disgusting, that seems very troubling. So go ahead, Lynn, and take the final verse here, verse 4 in this section.
Every flying insect that uses 4 legs for walking, it is an abomination to you. The only flying insects with 4 walking legs that you may eat are those which have knees extending above their feet, using these longer legs to hop on the ground.
So again, it uses the word sheketz, this word for abominable. And it also, if you didn't know, there are certain insects that I think some kind of locusts that are kosher. You just have to look at them and see if they're wearing knee pads or something like that, and then you know they're good to go. But again, if you wanted to try and get some consistency, try and learn out just from the pshat, the simple text itself, you do have this word sheketz. Now, there are verses in other sections having to do with sacrifices where it does talk about not eating certain bloods and fats. And there is some implication that it might do something to your soul. And we'll see that idea come back. But I just wanted to focus on the basic rules of kashrut, what can and can't be eaten in terms of every day, not about sacrifices, and what we can learn from this. So we learned that at least some of the animals are considered shkatzim, are disgusting or abominable. It doesn't explain why. And the only thing it doesn't say it about fish or about land mammals. It only says it about birds and insects. So maybe there's something about birds of prey. Maybe there's something about creepy crawly animals flying. It's not, there are hints at a reason here, but it's not consistent. So before we go on, are there any questions just on this initial section? And then we'll look at the most famous attempts at trying to bring meaning to this. Gloria and Leonard, I'm going to unmute you, and then I'll leave you unmuted to read the next section. And Lynn, thank you very much for your reading. Yeah, Gloria, please.
You sort of touched on this in the last second, but this says every flying insect, and then it says 4 legs. So what about creepy crawlies, with 100 legs or?
So all creepy crawlies, everything that crawls around, is no good.
Yeah.
It's very, very limited. There might be another verse elsewhere that specifically says that the only flying insects with 4 walking legs that you may eat. So I'm not sure if it was somewhere else, but there is specific text. Maybe it's in another parsha. It talks about all the things that like crawl across like lizards and caterpillars, etc., are forbidden. So again, I could have brought a much longer section, and the word sheketz may be mentioned elsewhere. But I think what's more interesting is we're seeing here a hint at this word shekatzim, but you're going to see that at least some of the initial rabbis' attempts to explain this don't really go in that direction. They hint at it maybe, and some of them go back to it. But we'll see where they go and why they go that direction. Excellent. So Gloria, if you would take, and we'll go on to the next page, probably not the first opinion, but one of the most well-known opinions is that of Rambam, Maimonides, in his 12th century Guide for the Perplexed, which again was speaking to people who were trying to, it was almost like the early Enlightenment was happening in the Golden Age and, around Spain, et cetera, and people were questioning religion, and he was trying to find a balance between ancient philosophy that made sense and the Torah that didn't always seem to make sense, particularly kashrut, which often doesn't make sense. So please, Gloria.
Okay. I maintain that the food which is forbidden by the law is unwholesome.
Before you go on, Gloria, and he'll expand on that, but that's basically his point. He made his point right away. Asrato haTorah alenu amina machalim mezuna megune. All of this food is just not good. It's just like unhealthy, it's bad. And that's basically his point here, is that anything which is forbidden by the Torah is unhealthy. And if you've heard this argument before, you probably heard the rejection, which we'll read in the next source. And if not, listen to his answer and think about, is it logically consistent? Is it compelling? But that's basically his point. Treif food, unkosher food, is bad for you. Please, Gloria.
There is nothing among the forbidden food, kinds of food whose injurious character is doubted, except pork and fat. But also in these cases, the doubt is not justified, for pork contains more moisture than necessary for human food and too much of superfluous matter.
So you know that someone's argument is already kind of getting a little wonky when they need to do all of these asterisks and exceptions to rules. So he starts, all tray food is unhealthy, except for pork and fat. I can't really explain that, but yes, I can. Pork is full of water. Now, I've never actually had pork in my life. And I don't know. I know what it smells like. I walked through in Prague, like this meat place, and I'll never get that smell out of my soul. But I don't know if pork is full of moisture. I don't know if there's any scientific basics for that. But still, the fact that it seems like he's grasping for straws on that to make his theory consistent. But he continues, Gloria.
The principal reason why the law forbids swine's flesh is to be found in the circumstance that its habits and its food are very dirty and loathsome. It has already been pointed out how emphatically the law enjoins the removal of the sight of loathsome objects, even in the field and in the camp. How much more objectionable is such a sight in towns?
So there is another mitzvah that talks about in a battlefield before a war to take care of the bathrooms basically and make sure those are cleaned away, shoveled over. Like, it's disgusting. It's inappropriate to have in a place which and they actually consider war, at least certain wars, to be a sacred duty. So you don't want to have a potty right next to you. But he's saying here, they're full of moisture. But I have another reason. They eat dirty stuff. And because of an unrelated mitzvah about us not wanting to see dirty stuff, then an animal which eats filth, obviously. And again, and one of my rabbis said this, when you're trying to come up with so many explanations for something, it means the fundamental premise, which isn't necessarily wrong. And maybe the fundamental premise is right, that it's unhealthy, but you haven't come up with the right proof for it. But his proofs here are all, this is not his best work, I'll say. And Ramban is going to back me up in the next source. Please continue.
But if it were allowed to eat swine's, but if it were allowed to eat swine's flesh, the streets and houses would be more dirty than any cesspool, as may be seen at present in the country of the Franks. A saying of our sages declares, the mouth of a swine is as dirty as dung itself.
So they have a line like that in the Talmud, so it's certainly a bad association. But by the way, Ramban is not going to disagree. He's kind of build on this premise in a different way, but a later rabbi will clearly knock this out. But just Gloria and Leonard, what are some of the fundamental logical flaws in saying that all tray food is fundamentally unhealthy? And if anyone else has they're like, oh, obviously because of this. And if you don't get it, we'll come back to it later. But and again, he doesn't say it's bad for your soul. He says it's physically unhealthy. What is the problem with that? Is saying that eating tray food is unhealthy, physically unhealthy for a person?
Well, I'm sure there are foods that are okay, to eat, that are not kosher.
So that could be the flip side of it. There are plenty of trait foods that, I mean, well, basically, look around at non-Jews. There are plenty of non-Jews who are unhealthy and overweight, just they're Jews who are unhealthy and overweight. But I'm pretty sure Michael Phelps is not Jewish. And he eats, what does he eat? Like a Big Mac every time he went for a swim. So obviously, it's not physically unhealthy. So, and also it's possible to eat only kosher food and also be super unhealthy. One of my best friends is vegan. I remember watching my friend one time going to a salad bar in a kosher place and just getting all of the most unhealthy stuff that was technically all unkosher. And that was a one-time thing. In general, my friend is very healthy, but still, the point is that kashrut and health do not equal each other. And for people who, certainly you can keep kosher and you can be healthy, but they're not mutually exclusive. Kashrut has nothing to do with a physically healthy lifestyle. That is a separate thing. And in fact, Rambam himself says there's a mitzvah to eat healthy, but that's not connected to kashrut itself. So we'll see that rejected clearly later. But this argument is not very strong, and you can see he's really struggling here to put it together. Now, the Ramban, Leonard, I'll have you take, goes off in a slightly different direction, but has some similar tropes here, trying to explain kashrut. And I guess I said that the idea of shkatzim, disgusting, won't be really explored. And in some way, I guess that was wrong. Rambam doesn't explicitly say shkatzim, that word disgusting or abominable, but by talking about disgusting pigs, etc., that seems to really hint at what the Torah is getting at. So if you read that, they're disgusting. Oh, it's disgusting, unhealthy food. That's not a wild thing. It's just not factually true. So it's not a strong argument. So Leonard, if you'll take the Ramban, and we'll see how he takes a crack at this.
The reason for certain birds being forbidden as food is on account of their cruel nature. It is also possible that the reason for certain animals being forbidden is similar, since no animal that chews the cud and has a parted hoof is a beast of prey, while the rest all devour others. There has also been found a difference in nature between animals fit for food and those which are unfit, as the sages have mentioned, namely that all milks of animals fit for food curdle, whereas all milks of those unfit for food do not coagulate and cannot ever be made into cheese. Thus, they are physically different. It is possible to say on the basis of this difference in their natures and that those animals unfit for food harm human beings who eat them.
So at the end, the Ramban comes to a similar conclusion to Maimonides, to the Rambam, about there's something fundamentally unhealthy. But he also adds a lot of layers here that are interesting and are kind of trying to find a connected logical stream between all the sources. Birds of prey, it seems like birds of prey, there's this evil thing. So maybe it seems like the direction he's going here is it's not that it's physically unhealthy, it's that the very idea of eating birds and animals that are murderous and that eat other animals, it's bad for your soul. But no one said that yet. He ends up here by saying it's just bad for your body. So again, we know that one can certainly eat pork and be very unhealthy, but one can also eat beef and be very unhealthy. And this fact here about curdling, that only kosher mammals, their milk curdles, I don't know if that's true. I either read that that's definitely not true or that actually is true. So I don't know if anyone knows here if cat's milk, you can make cheese out of it. I mean, don't make cheese out of it, but Gloria doesn't like that idea, but you can look it up as a fact. Regardless, here he's still getting into physical characteristics of these animals and trying to find a common characteristic. But again, while he is hitting on some things, the birds that are forbidden seem to be birds of prey. Oh, maybe there's something there. He still ends up in there's something about the health aspect, and that just doesn't work. And what we see next, so we've gone from 12th century with Maimonides to 13th century with Ramban Nachmanides, and now we're in the 15th century. And scientific knowledge, we're not at the Enlightenment yet, but scientific knowledge is progressing constantly. And one of the interesting things is when you had Maimonides write his Mishnah Torah, he was a doctor of his times. Some of his medical knowledge still true today, but a lot of it is bunk. And it's not because he wasn't one of the wisest men to ever live. It wasn't his fault. It was just the science of the day. The problem is he sometimes codified some of you should drink this, or you should eat food that's left out to sit in the sun. And some of those things are just bad scientific knowledge. So the problem is when we confuse God's ritual laws, which have spiritual bases, or just because God told us, with scientific knowledge, and we call that mitzvot and commandments. And Dan Yitzchak Abravanel, who wrote a beautiful, incredible commentary on the Torah, takes that to task and says, we need to make a distinction here. And Jane, I'll go ahead and unmute you for this next source. We need to make a clear distinction between God's law in the Torah and books of medical advice. And unfortunately, some of the earlier generations didn't do well at that. And by the way, any of us who have ever heard, and some of you may believe it, some of these old wives' tales or old husbands' tales, I want to be equal opportunity, old people's tales, old folk tales about these health remedies that you might swear by. And if I told you the scientific evidence on it, like I'll often do with my wife, and she's like, stop destroying, stop being a myth breaker. She hates when I do that. Doesn't matter what I tell you, the factual science, you might say, oh no, it works for me. So 1 person out of 6 billion it works for, therefore it must be true. So I'm not going to do that here. I'm not going to destroy all of your myth beliefs and everything like that about science. But Yitzchak Abravanel says there's no place for that in the Torah. So Jane, please.
God forbid that I should believe such a thing. If that were the case, then the Torah of the Lord would be no more than an insignificant and overly concise medical treatise. This is not the way of the Torah of the Lord or of its profound objectives. Besides, with our own eyes, we see how the nations that consume the flesh of the pig, detestable things, the mouse, as well as other impure birds, land animals, and fish, are all alive and well, strong, and not at all feeble or frail. All of this is a clear indication that the divine Torah did not come to heal the body or to promote physical health, but rather to foster the health of the soul and to heal its afflictions. Therefore, the Torah forbade these foods because they have a deleterious effect on the pure and intelligent soul, breeding insensitivity in the human soul and corrupting its desires. This causes the formation of an evil nature that breeds a spirit of tuma and banishes the spirit of tahara and holiness, concerning which David implored, do not take your spirit of holiness from me.
Excellent, thank you. So I love this piece for a few things. One is just looking at the piece in whole, it shows that one can be a deeply religious, deeply faithful, one of the greatest commentaries on the Torah, and also be rational and use common sense and be intellectually honest. He uses empirical evidence, meaning looking at what you see around you, and you see people eat treif of the other nations and they're totally fine. So it obviously cannot be that. And he just rejects it outright. And he does so not in, he starts with, God forbid I should believe this kind of stuff. But it's interesting that people can really push back against rabbis of earlier generations and do so with respect and, again, intellectual honesty, and still have a scientific outlook and still be totally believing in God and God's Torah. So he said, obviously it's not that. Now, again, there's nothing in the text that gives them a clear, clearly this is what it means. Otherwise, we wouldn't be having this conversation if the Torah was clear. So what he's going to do now, and the rabbis are pretty much going to run with this, is to say the Torah is clearly saying that these foods are bad for the Israelites. It doesn't say they're bad for all people. God says you cannot eat this. And we know that it doesn't make us unhealthy, or it's not unhealthy food physically. So what must it be bad for? Obviously, something we cannot see with the eye, that you can't test scientifically. Hence, it's bad for the soul. It must be, eating treif food must be bad for our souls. Now, that's an interesting conversation to have with someone who's a Jew and doesn't keep kosher. Now, do they believe they have a soul? Again, that's a huge other conversation, and they may find this line of reasoning very troubling. Now, again, the Torah doesn't say that. That's what the rabbis derive, but it has become kind of the popular view. So if you're trying to convince someone to at least explore the idea of kashrut, and they are a spiritual person, bring them the Yitzchak Abravanel. Don't shove it in their face, but open up that line of thinking, not in a judgmental way, but that food, the whole idea you are what you eat, can create a kind of spiritual identity. That somebody who only eats kosher food, whether or not it actually affects their body in any way, just the idea of being a person with a committed, specific practice of eating of thoughtful eating and where they eat and what they eat can help them psychologically, and in this case, we believe, spiritually. So before we go on to the final section, which is really going to just expand on this idea, are there any questions up until now? Yeah, Jane, please.
So I don't know if you're going to get to this in the next section, but it's also a method of separating us, particularly in the diaspora.
Yeah. So if I'm understanding what you're talking about, there are a number of kashrut practices about not eating food that's been cooked by a non-Jew, or not eating at a place of non-Jew. Are you kind of hinting at that, or you mean just in general?
Well, I mean, let's say you're at a meeting, or you're in, even in the lunchroom at your place of work, and you're eating in a certain way, and people say, well, why are you eating this? Or why are you ordering a special meal? Or why are you taking your own lunch when it's being catered? Then you have to explain yourself, and you're separating yourself from the group.
No, I hear that. And there's a number of rabbinic laws that were developed intentionally, like a priori, to do just that, to prevent assimilation. And the rabbis talk about preventing intermarriage. And they have things, you can't eat food that's been cooked by a non-Jew. There's certain places you can't eat, can't go out getting drunk in a bar because it'll create, this camaraderie the rabbis are opposed to. And a lot of those laws were developed at a time when the relationships between Jews and mostly Christians, not real idolaters, but mostly Christianity, those relationships were fraught, bad as can be. Today, it's hard for us to think that we can't go out for a cup of tea with our friend who's non-Jewish. I've gone out for a cup of tea with a priest before, but there are opinions that say you can't even do that much, can't have that kind of friendship. So I think that was a later development. I think what you're saying is this very idea of just separating our nation, and I definitely think there's something to that. Again, the text doesn't say that, so your read, Jane, is as valid as all of these other ones. The reason I didn't bring it is mostly because it just wasn't proposed in the later text, and it becomes an explicit practice that the rabbis include later. Also, if we were just keeping biblical kashrut, the separation wouldn't be quite as distinct, meaning that I could go in, according to just the Torah, I could go to one of those public meetings and I could eat most of the stuff on the plate. If there's fruits, maybe I would have to take, because if it was in Israel and there were fruits, maybe I would take a few fruits off the plate because of the laws of offering first fruits, truma, et cetera, like that, or ma'aser. But otherwise, the bread, the drinks, there was nothing, the Torah doesn't talk about, you need to worry about the factory. And if there was a rabbi, mashgiach, overlooking it, it just talks about the animals you can and cannot eat. And in terms of how to slaughter them, it's not even for all the animals. If I kept biblical kashrut, I could go to a regular fish restaurant and just eat any fish off the menu that was kosher. Obviously, today, we've gone crazy strict with kashrut, and that is a well-known fact. From the separation of dishes to being, on Pesach is a real example of that. But we've really gone far beyond. But if we just kept by the Torah, there wouldn't be such an explicit separation in our dealings with non-Jews, other than if they said, would you like pork? I'll say, no, thank you, but I'll have a slice of bread and some, was that cream cheese from a cow or something like that? Does that kind of respond to I think that's an excellent suggestion, but I think that idea is brought in later explicitly by the rabbis. But it could be valid. Hashem may have intent, again, you have to ask God. Anybody has a through line, go for it. So this last section that we'll look at here, Isabel, I will unmute you for this third to last source. And this one is kind of just reiterating. In fact, I'll just skip this one. The Kli Yakar, who's an amazing commentary from 17th century, says the same thing as a Bravanel, which is obviously it's not about health because plenty of non-Jews are healthy. Clearly, it's some kind of spiritual thing. And then I'll have you, Isabel, take source 2. We're actually going back in time now to the 6th century and earlier, where this idea is proposed, or not this idea, another idea is kind of thrown out in the Bereshit Rabbah, which is this. Maybe it's health, maybe it's not health. Maybe it's spiritual, maybe it's not spiritual. Maybe it's making us a unique, kadosh, separated people. Well, at the end of the day, we don't know the reason. So why do we still do it? Isabel, source number 2, please.
Are we reading out one?
Rav said the mitzvot.
Rav said the mitzvot were only given so that man might be refined by them. Do you really think that the Holy One of Blessing cares if an animal is slaughtered by front or by the back of the neck? Therefore, mitzvot was only given to make humans better.
Excellent.
Just go ahead.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
I just want to say a few thoughts on this. There's actually two things going on here. One thing he's saying is, look, we don't understand the mitzvot, and there may not even be any rhyme or reason to them. It really doesn't matter whether we can eat shellfish or not. What really matters is God told us not to eat shellfish. God told us, to slaughter things in a certain way and what animals to eat. And the whole point is, we shouldn't think so carefully about why this animal is permitted and this one is forbidden. Doesn't really matter. God told us what we can eat, and we do it because God commanded us. However, there is this more general idea that we can apply to kashrut specifically, which is that somehow, and we don't know it, somehow mitzvot do make us better. So there's nothing inherently bad about eating lobster. But the fact that God commanded us to eat in a certain way, and maybe in some ways this kind of connects to what you said, Jane, maybe there is a more global, universal thing. It's not about the food themselves. It's about creating a separate eating system that's unique to the Jewish, to the Israelite, to the Hebrew people. And if you live in that system, somehow it can make you better. Now, one pushback on that is going back to my class, can you be observant and a bad person? I said, if somebody really keeps the whole corpus of Jewish law, it's hard for them to truly be evil. They might be a mean person, but even then there are laws to push against being mean. In the mitzvot of love your neighbor, etc. You can't really be a bad person, but you could definitely keep kashrut and be just the biggest, most awful person in the world. Keeping strictest kashrut, the absolute strictest kashrut, forget about other mitzvot. Someone can keep strict kashrut and be a terrible person. So it's also hard to apply that idea there. So maybe this midrash, is implying the whole system of mitzvot, if done ideally, makes us better people. And I do believe that to some extent, at least better Jews. But kashrut, again, there doesn't appear to be any immediate positive effects to it. There doesn't seem to be any logical reason why it would make us better, other than what we've suggested or has been suggested, which is it does something to our souls, which we're not aware of. And we're going to conclude here. I'll take this final source, Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch. We actually have, other than that midrash, we went back 1,000 years, we've been moving forward in history. So now we're in 19th century. Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, his work Chorev, which is he systematically goes through all the mitzvot and comes up with reasons for them. So what a great, and it's in English. I don't know if it's online, but I have a copy if someone wants to borrow. It's a great book. So he really runs through this idea of the soul, our body, and what we put into our bodies. So he says, just as the external temple, which represents your holy mission and to which you should sanctify yourself, becomes desecrated by impurity. So literally the temple or the Mishkan, the tabernacle, when impure things, again, things that are not fundamentally bad, they don't hurt people, but God said they're impure. And if you bring them in the temple, they make it impure and you can't do stuff in the temple. It's all abstract, magical thinking. I believe in it, but it's all spiritual stuff. So he says, just as that's all true with the physical temple, so are these feuds impure and unfit for your spirit, as far as they are all of them the living place of activity for your own being, which is summoned unto holiness. If you have eaten them, this tray food, pork, etc., not only touch, but absorb them into your system, you may be more nourished and better fed. He recognizes you could eat bacon in a healthy way and you'll be full. You'll get your protein, etc., like that, your lobster or whatever, your horse, whatever people eat. But the animal instinct will be aroused more strongly within you. And your body becomes more blunted as an instrument of the spirit. Your heart, instead of being holy, instead of only striving for holiness, namely your sublimity over everything animal-like, is drawn down to the animal, or become the more apathetic and dulled. Your spirit is now faced with a fiercer battle and is less equipped for the fight. What Rav Hirsch does here, Zatzal, is fascinating because he takes the idea of the tray food, unkosher food, being bad for your very soul, which has been proposed, and is, again, it's not testable, but it's the only thing that would be consistent with the whole Torah. It's the only thing that would tie all of the kashrut laws together, is that they are all bad for our soul, for our godly soul. And he totally supports that good. But then he brings in a whole other idea altogether, which is wild, which is when you eat animals, each of us is a combination of our flesh, which is animal, just like a rhinoceros or a mouse, but we're also a physical, it is physical, but we're also a spiritual soul, which comes specifically from God. And we want to live our lives giving prominence to the soul. We want to live our lives as godly soul people to, in some ways, separate ourselves from this world, to live above this world, to live in it, but to live above it by always doing goodly acts, godly acts, being spiritual. And when we eat tray food, that drags us down. And Rabbi Hirsch, if you said, are there other things that drag us down? He would say any other, probably use the phrase, pleasures of the flesh, as it were, but drugs, drinking, sleeping around, all these things drag us down to our animal nature and don't let our soul shine. And that's a powerful idea that the rabbis do talk about in many contexts. Rashi talks about, he says that that's really what kadosh holiness is going above our animal desires. Great, except why is that not true of cow? A cow is an animal, a goat is an animal, a chicken is an animal. So if all I eat is mostly chicken with a few vegetables, how is that helping my soul? And his answer could be, well, because God said that these animals are different. But again, as soon as these rabbis try and get to some, like they try and get too focused, try and come up with too consistent a reason that ties the animals together, the arguments start to fall apart. So the ultimate answer to the why of kashrut is we don't know. And so why do we keep it? Because God told us to. Is there something else that can be derived from the Torah? There are hints at it. The idea of shkatzim, disgustingness, doesn't tell us what's disgusting about it. There are hints at it. But is there one clear reason in the Torah for why kashrut, why some animals okay and some animals not? And the answer is no. However, I think that the rabbis, by talking about the spiritual nature and that it is good or bad for us in a level which we can't perceive, I think that's a powerful argument. And that's one that's accessible and one that can speak not to everyone. Somebody who wants a scientific reason, a Bravanel would say, stop reading the Torah. The Torah is not about science. It was never meant to be about science. It doesn't reject science, nor does it propose science. It is there for your community, for your soul, and your connection to God, which is beyond the laws of physics, beyond the laws of nature. Don't look for science in it because just like other science, it can be proven or disproven. But for God and the soul, it is eternal. And that is the thing about kashrut. The reasons for it are beyond us and they are eternal. If you make it about health, then kashrut stops making sense very quickly when science proceeds. But it's about your soul, then kashrut can have meaning forever.